For 21 mornings, I lifted the brass lid of my mailbox and pretended anticipation wasn't the same as dread. Utility bills slid out like dull cards. A thank you note from a bride I'd coached through a storm-threatened ceremony. Coupons, flyers, the machinery of other people's lives. Not the envelope I kept picturing, ivory stock copper plate letters, a raised crest in the corner. The Cross family had that kind of taste. Their son's engagement would not be announced on anything less. On day 7, I told myself they were still wrangling headcount. On day 14, I blamed the print shop. By day 21, I had no reasonable story left. The party for my only child was in 48 hours, and I, Eleanor Hart, who could seat a gala of 400 without blinking, had no invitation. I held my phone like it might bite, then called my son. 3 rings. 4. "Hey, Mom." Julian answered, voice winded like he'd jogged up steps. "Can I ring you back?" "I'm in the middle of—" "I'll be quick," I said, my voice doing that polite glide it had learned from years of smoothing edges. "I haven't received anything about the engagement celebration." A seam opened in the conversation. "Right. We're keeping it small," he said. Another seam, mostly Marina's side and a few of our friends from the city. "At Ravenswood?" I asked. The rumor among vendors had already made the rounds. He exhaled in that old adolescent way, the sigh I remembered from SAT season. "It's just a reception, Mom." "Black tie, yes, but you wouldn't know anyone. It's more their circle." "I know you." The quiet landed heavier than I meant. "It's not a big deal," he said, and then his voice brightened with relief at my supposed acceptance. "I've got to run. Marina and I are meeting the coordinator. We'll do dinner soon." After the line went dead, I looked at the neat square I'd blocked off on my kitchen calendar, Saturday 7 p.m., J&M engagement. Next to it in my handwriting, pick up crystal flutes from Holden & Co. 2 months I'd spent finding the exact pair, the kind that catch light at the lip. I pressed a palm to the counter until my breath returned to pace. My assistant Maya pinged me then. "Did you see Sloane Whitaker's story? She needs a hairstylist rec for J&M's Ravenswood thing. Says she's never been." Sloane. I had staged her brother's lake house, I do. I had set her Sweet 16 beneath a ceiling of paper lanterns that everyone copied for a year. I opened Instagram. Sloane's flat lay was relentlessly tasteful, an invitation on linen, a sprig of eucalyptus, a cufflink. "Celebrate the engagement of Marina Cross and Julian Hart." It read in burnished ink, "Black tie at Ravenswood Country Club, 180 guests. There is a sound a mind makes when it stops bargaining." In the quiet that followed, I didn't travel back through 32 years, through the nursing shifts that ran past midnight, the 5-hour Sunday drives during Julian's freshman fall, the semester I pawned my rings to cover tuition. I stayed where I was in my bright kitchen with its reliable clock, holding a fact that didn't consent to softening. I was not wanted there. I opened my banking app. 6 months earlier, I'd created a sub-account labeled JNSM September Travel, a habit born of my profession budget earmarked deliver. I had watched the number tick up $22,500 each time a client's wire came in. My thumb hovered. If I moved it back, the shape of our relationship would change. If I left it, perhaps I was agreeing to be invisible. The transfer completed with a polite chime. The abruptness of it astonished me. The money reclaimed itself like breath. Next, my email. The bookings had been favors called in across a dozen seasons of saying yes to crises at midnight. A cliffside suite above Lake Como held by Chiara at Villa Narina. A week reserved at a machiya in Kyoto, where the proprietor knew my tea preferences. 3 nights in the Seychelles ocean view, late checkout guaranteed. I wrote to each contact, not defensive, not apologizing for a thing I hadn't promised. "Please release the Heartcross file. Unfortunately, plans have changed. I hope we'll work together soon." When the last message left my outbox, the house made a new sound, an absence that was not exactly loss. In that space, a different thought formed, almost shy. You could go somewhere alone. Not to punish, not to make a point. Simply because there was no one to ask permission from. I called Nate, my travel agent. "Do you remember that place by the old mining town, the Hot Springs?" "Dunton," he said. "Outside Telluride, stone cabins and a river that won't mind your mood. Tomorrow." He didn't scold. Professionals who've watched you rebuild an event from a flooded ballroom don't ask whether you're sure. "I can get you there by afternoon," he said. "Pack warm." 24 hours later, I sat on a porch that smelled faintly of pine and mineral, a wool throw over my knees, a flute of something dry and celebratory sweating in my hand. The mountains were a moving lesson in shadow. A staffer offered to take a photo, and I let him. In the frame, my hair looked more silver than I remembered. My smile looked like it belonged only to me. I posted it without a caption, then changed my mind and typed Telluride alone, starting over. Night in the high country is deep. Sometime around midnight, my phone abandoned on the nightstand began its second life as a drum. When I woke to the pale rectangle of morning, the screen was crowded with insistence: 52 missed calls, 31 texts. Most were from Julian, lined up in intervals: 7:43 p.m. Where are you? The travel account is empty. 8:10 p.m. Mom, call me. The Como hold is gone. 9:02 p.m. Are you at a resort right now? 9:15 p.m. from Maya. Are you okay? He was at the office hunting for honeymoon paperwork. 10:27 p.m. This isn't funny. 12:04 a.m. You made Marina cry. 1:11 a.m. Her mother is furious. 2:19 a.m. I don't recognize you. I set the phone face down on the dresser. Outside, river light braided itself through the cottonwoods. The cabin's kettle clicked when the water boiled. The cups were heavy pottery, the kind that asked to be held with both hands. I carried coffee out to the porch and fed myself deliberately biscuits that flaked fruit still cool at the core. I noticed how different food tastes when it isn't swallowed while confirming a vendor's arrival time. There is a list you keep when you spend your life providing backup plans. Vendor alternates the conversation that will soothe a rude guest without letting them win. This morning I made a different list on hotel stationery things that were mine. Not goals, not vows, just nouns, mornings, blue ink. Rooms with color chosen because it pleased me, a class I'd bookmarked and never booked. The line paused. I wrote one more word: boundaries. Only then did I pick up my phone. I did not call. I wrote clean and spare, the way I'd write a directive to a jittery team an hour before doors opened. I am safe. The travel arrangements and funds you were aware of were contingent gifts, not obligations. I have withdrawn them. I need time to consider how we relate as adults. I will reach out next week. E. I sent it. The delivery dot appeared. I turned off all notifications from his number. The sound that followed was not silence exactly. It was the sound of a house the moment the last rental chair is folded and the floor finally visible breathes. I dressed in the new sweater I'd bought in the gift shop the night before, too soft, too expensive, chosen anyway. I slid my phone into a drawer. The path to the river began at the back steps, then disappeared into willow and stone. I took it without announcing where I was going or when I'd be back. The path along the river threaded between willow roots and slate. I walked it until the sound of the current began to live inside my ribs. No phone, no watch, just boot soles and the wet green smell of late summer. When I finally turned back toward the cabin, the porch was warm where the sun had held it, and the kettle was exactly where I'd left it. I poured more coffee and read the single word I'd written at the bottom of my list: boundaries, until it looked like something I could hold without cracking. By mid-afternoon, I called the office. Maya had already triaged a client meltdown about rental chairs that weren't the right shade of ivory. "We're fine," she said. "I put you on a soft hold for the rest of the week. If a ceiling falls in, I'll text." I thanked her and didn't ask if Julian had stopped by. Information arrives whether you ask for it or not. I had decided, at least for the next few days, to let silence earn its space. I flew home 2 mornings later. The mountains fell away into a quilt of fields, then a rind of water, then the city's matted gray. As the plane taxied, my phone blinked awake a new stack of messages, several unknown numbers and one text from Julian waiting like someone seated in the foyer. Coat on, pretending patience. "We need to talk today, 7. Reflex made my thumb want to type yes. I could see it happen, the old choreography, the shuffling of my own plans to accommodate his urgency, the way the apology would land on my tongue before I could decide whether it belonged to me. I watched the reflex rise and recede. Then I wrote, "I have plans this evening, tomorrow at 2, my house." 3 dots bloomed, disappeared, bloomed again. "Fine. Tomorrow." At home, the air had a stale, shut-in smell that didn't match the immaculate surfaces. My neighbor had collected the mail and tucked it in a tidy stack on the console. The hydrangeas in the yard had browned at the edges. I carried the suitcase upstairs, intending to unpack, and stopped in the doorway of my own bedroom. I had decorated it years ago with timeless in mind linen headboard beige drapery that wouldn't offend future buyers, a rug chosen from a sample fan by process of elimination. If a photographer had asked me to stand in the room and point to the thing I loved most, I'd have failed the test. In the study, the bookshelves carried trophies that hadn't been dusted in a seasoned glass awards with etched fonts that looked dated, a shadow box from the year Julian's team made state. The guest room held a bed he hadn't used in 5 years, still made with the navy duvet he'd taken to freshman housing and brought back when he moved into the city with roommates who preferred concrete floors. The living room felt staged for an open house. If a stranger had walked through and asked who belonged here, the answer would have been a mother who throws good parties. I slept without dreams. At 1:58 the next day, the front door opened without a knock. keys in my son's hand had always felt practical, the way families work the fallback that lets you water plants and pick up packages. Hearing the lock turn now sounded like an assumption I hadn't meant to grant forever. He stood in the kitchen doorway, always taller than I remembered, as if height resettled by inches each time I saw him. His jaw looked tight the way it had when he was 12 and coached himself not to cry after losing a game. "Mom," he said, a little breathless, as if climbing a flight of stairs he hadn't anticipated. "Coffee?" I asked. My voice came out even. I was grateful to it. "I don't want coffee." He didn't sit. "I want to understand what you did." I rested a mug on the counter anyway because the ritual steadied my hands. "Ask me something I can answer. Why did you pull the travel money?" His pupils were large. He hadn't been sleeping. "Why cancel the holds?" Marina was humiliated. Her mother called half our guest list to explain. "You made us look." He swallowed the word. I withdrew my gift. I kept my tone level, almost clinical. It was never promised. You knew it existed because I trusted you enough to let you know what I was building. When I learned I was excluded from your celebration, I reconsidered. I set the mug down. That's the linear version. Excluded. He scrubbed a hand over his face. It wasn't, Mom Ravenswood has constraints. It's a cross thing, their network, their expectations. You wouldn't have known people. You would have been uncomfortable. I organize rooms full of strangers for a living, I said. Comfort isn't the question. Being wanted is. He flinched and the defensive architecture went up again. This feels punitive. Like you're teaching me a lesson. You vanished to a resort and posted about starting over while my fiancé cried in a coat room. I've been fielding calls from her mother from vendors you know personally. Do you understand how this looks? That my mother is underwriting our honeymoon that I can't provide. I don't care how it looks. I care what it is. I thought of the river and the white line of foam where it ran shallow. I didn't promise you a product. I gathered something lovely because I wanted to, the way I have gathered 1,000 lovely things for other people. When I discovered I wasn't welcome, I put it back in my pocket. His shoulders dropped, then hitched. You're rewriting history. I've done nothing but accommodate you. I stayed local for college because Dad died and you were alone. I turned down a better offer in Chicago because you needed me nearby. I come for dinner every Sunday. I felt a precise click inside my chest, the sound of a lock finding the correct notch. Let's take those one at a time, I said, still gentle, no heat. You chose state because they offered a full scholarship you earned. You took the Mitchell and Howe job because it paid best and had the clearest path up. I cooked on Sundays so you would want to come home to something warm. At any point did I ask you to choose otherwise? He opened his mouth, then closed it. We both turned slightly as if listening for a third person who could arbitrate. I'm not punishing you, Jules, I said. The nickname softened the syllables. It had been years since I used it. I am stopping something that has lost its shape. I don't require you to involve me in your decisions. I do require that if I am asked to contribute financially, emotionally, logistically, I am treated as part of the family rather than as a concierge. He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't sharp. So, this is transactional after all. You're the one using invoices, I said. I'm talking about belonging. For a long minute, he studied the grain of the butcher block island, the tiny scratches where knives had kissed wood. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped a register. Marina's mother, Beatrice, says this is a misunderstanding. She wants to talk to you. She says she assumed certain customs. That groom's families contribute in particular ways. Beatrice may call, I said. I'll be polite. I lifted the mug and took a sip, though the coffee had grown tepid. As for customs, you and Marina can have whichever ones you like. You can also refuse the ones that harm people you say you love. He winced, then straightened as if deciding to carry the bruise rather than hide it. I need time, he said. Take it, I answered. You're an adult, so am I. He didn't slam a door. He put his empty glass in the dishwasher with careful hands, as if refusing to let small gestures give him away, and let himself out. The house was very quiet. I stood in the kitchen until I could name the quiet as mine rather than as an echo left by someone else. Then I walked through each room with a yellow legal pad and put a word at the top of each page, keep, donate, sell. I wrote beneath those headings without sentimentality. The 12-seat table I bought for dinners that never materialized. The china service that looked like it belonged to someone else's lineage. The rug in the living room that hid stains by being the color of no decision at all. The real estate agent's name came to me while I was labeling a box of picture frames. Ava Santangelo had sold 3 of my friends their afterhomes. When I called, she picked up on the second ring. Eleanor, she said, familiar in a way I found unexpectedly kind. Yes. I didn't bother giving context. Women in her line of work hear the subtext, while the client is still pretending a staging consult is just a whim. I want to list this week if possible. It's possible, she said. I'll be there at 10 tomorrow. Wear shoes, you can move in. By noon the next day, Ava had walked the house, taken notes, and arranged for a photographer who arrived with a bouquet of pale peonies and a light wand that made even the dim hallway look aspirational. At 5, a stake sign with her name leaned in the lawn, and 2 neighbors texted to ask if everything was all right. I wrote back, yes, change of season. Julian called shortly after. You're selling as if I donated his childhood to a thrift store without asking. I am, I said. I'll find something that fits my life. He stopped. I need to think. Good, I said, meanly relieved to be using the same sentence he had used 2 days earlier. The doorbell rang the following afternoon while the photographer's images were still propagating across the real estate sites. I recognized Beatrice Cross through the glass before I opened the door, a posture born of Pilates and country club committees, a pearl at one ear the size of a sugared almond. Her perfume arrived a second before she did, expensive and restrained. Ms. Hart, she said with the formality of someone who hasn't decided what you are to her. I hope I'm not intruding. Come in, I said, and gestured toward the living room. I did not apologize for the moving boxes. They made the room honest. She refused coffee but crossed one ankle over the other coat folded beside her like a deliberate line. Let me be direct, she said. Saturday was unfortunate. I accept responsibility for the guest list. We had obligations, business associates of my husband, a long-standing crowd you may not enjoy. It seemed kinder to spare you an evening among strangers. You spared me, I repeated. Her eyes flicked to the window, to the sign outside. I understand there were financial arrangements you were considering. We had planned certain allocations with the expectation of a contribution from the groom's side. She tapped a manicured finger against her bag. The young couple is under stress. I was hoping we could restore harmony. There it was, the tidy noun for what money can do when held by the person who thinks they are the one keeping the ledger. Mrs. Cross, I said, I'm sure you are excellent at the math of weddings. I am withdrawing, not negotiating. Her expression didn't slip so much as still. You would deprive your son of joy to make a point. I'm depriving no one, I said, stunned by how calm I felt. They may honeymoon wherever they wish, within the means they decide. My money is mine to use or not. I'm no longer in the business of purchasing access to rooms that don't want me in them. We looked at one another for a count that could have been 10 and could have been eternity. Then she rose as if grateful to have found the floor again. I see, she said. Thank you for your time. Her shoes made no sound on the hardwood. The perfume lingered after the door closed, a sweetness at odds with the conversation. By Friday, Ava texted 2 offers in hand, more showings booked. The sensation I felt wasn't triumph. It was a lightness that kept surprising me in small places, the inside of wrists, the back of knees, as if blood had learned a new route. That evening, Maya came by with cartons and a roll of bubble wrap, her hair in a knot, that said she'd come straight from a rehearsal dinner. She didn't ask what had happened. She asked where to begin. We wrapped what I wanted to take. We laughed over a set of candlesticks shaped like partridges that some bride had gifted me in a flush of post-ceremony gratitude. We found a photo of Julian at 5 with a gap-toothed grin and taped it to the inside of a box labeled Keep so it wouldn't get lost. When she left, she pressed a thin envelope into my hand. Courier dropped this at the office, she said. Figured you'd want it tonight. The cardstock was heavy enough to feel expensive, but not ostentatious, the calligraphy precise without being fussy. It was exactly the kind of invitation I would have chosen if someone had asked me to choose. I read the printed words, the date, the venue, the names, and then the smaller rectangle tucked behind it, the handwriting I knew like the inside of my own hand. Mom, I hope you'll come. I know things are strained. I want you there. Can we talk, Jay? I set the invitation on the kitchen island beside the yellow pads. The peonies Beatrice's perfume had made me think of them opened a little more in the vase under the lamplight. I turned off the overheads and stood for a moment in the kind of dark that invites you to measure the room by heart rather than by shape. Then I reached for a pen. I wrote back on the invitation card itself, where the paper held ink without bleeding, Friday 7. Here, let's talk. E. He replied within the hour, I'll bring wine. All afternoon, the house kept its new honesty. Boxes were labeled in a row, the yellow pads stacked like placards. Keep, donate, sell, each a decision already spoken aloud. I slid the 12-seat dining table toward the wall and unfolded the small oak drop leaf I kept for tastings, setting 2 places by the window that looked onto the hydrangeas. I cooked because it steadied me saffron stock rice, a pan big enough to gather intentions and heat until they agreed. At 7, the doorbell rang. No key turning, just a ring like any other guest would use. When I opened the door, Julian was holding a bottle and a small bag with tissue paper peeking out the little flourish he had learned from my world without noticing. This place looks different, he said, stepping into the living room that had become a transit station. Smaller somehow. Closer, I said. Come in. We ate without circling the thing we'd come to say. He told me about a case he was second-chairing about a deli near his office that undersalted their soup, about the city finally fixing the light at Whitwell and 10th. Familiar chaff. The rice in the pan finished with a hiss, and I brought it to the table, settling the pan on a trivet, the saffron staining the steam gold. He poured wine, took a sip, set the glass down with care. "I owe you an apology," he said as plainly as if he were announcing the weather. "You should have been invited to the engagement party. I should have insisted. I didn't. I'm sorry." I set my fork down because my hands wanted something to do with the feeling that rose up too quickly to look at directly. "Thank you," I said. He reached into the small bag and slid a wrapped parcel across the table. Inside, I found a leather journal the color of dark tea, my initials stamped at the corner, and a pen that fit my fingers on the first try. "For your lists," he said, then looked embarrassed. "And for things that aren't lists." "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. He breathed, and some of the tension he had brought in with him loosened. "We've been talking, Marina and I, about money, about what belongs to us and what doesn't. We're not taking honeymoon funds from either family. We'll go somewhere we can afford now. We can save for the rest." "That sounds clear," I said. He gave a quick, grateful nod as if I had stamped a form he had been afraid would be rejected. He ate, then set his fork down again. "I'm asking for 2 things," he said, and the careful way he laid out his words reminded me of the child who lined up pebbles on the edge of a lake before choosing which to throw. "First, will you come to the wedding, as my mother? Not to work, just to be there." "Yes," I said, and felt something unclench in my spine. "Second, will you read during the ceremony? We found a passage about choosing each other without losing ourselves." And he stopped. "It sounded like you." I didn't trust my voice for a moment. Then I said I'd be honored. He nodded once, like a man allowing himself relief. The corners of his mouth wanted to lift and didn't quite know how. We finished dinner without returning to the minefield. After, he stood and looked around the half-packed room. "Where are the photos?" he asked. "The hallway used to be full of them." "In a box marked keep," I said. "I'll hang some of them wherever I land." He took this in. "You're really selling." "I am." He gestured toward the window where the hydrangeas were haloed by a street lamp. "I thought this was permanent." "Permanent is a word furniture stores use," I said. "People move." He didn't argue. He dried the dishes without asking where the towels were because he remembered, and left a little before midnight, taking the empty bottle and leaving the bag, the careful tissue folded into a rectangle on the counter. Ava called 2 mornings later to say we had a full-price offer with a pleasant timeline and a buyer who loved the light. I signed and cleaned and packed and began to live in rooms that echoed on the second word when I spoke. The day the movers came, Maya brought coffees and stood with me on the porch while the truck's ramp rattled under strangers' feet. "You okay?" she asked. "I am," I said, and it surprised me that this was not an act. The wedding was 3 weeks after closing. I spent the interim in a rental with tall windows and paint the landlord called Cloud and I called almost blue. On the morning of the ceremony, I zipped myself into a dress the color of midnight pawns with a neckline that pleased me, even if it made no statement about anyone else's taste. I pinned my hair up and left the house early enough to arrive before the crowd. Ravenswood had been polished for the day until even the hedges looked ironed. White chairs stood in rows on the back lawn, facing a floral arch that climbed into a borrowed sky. In the lobby, a string quartet rehearsed carelessly, their scales weaving through chatter from the staging area. A clipboarded woman I recognized from colleagues' stories checked off names with brisk, competent strokes. Maya wore a silver dress and grinned when she saw me. "You're on the guest side," she said with the pleasure of naming a thing we both wanted named. Beatrice approached, perfume more citrus today, smile fixed with the necessary number of watts. "Eleanor," she said as if we'd been emailing fondly, "you look lovely. So do you." Her gown was the exact shade of expensive champagne. It understood what room it belonged to. She glanced toward the garden. "Thank you for reading." Julian spoke so warmly of it. "I'm glad to be here." If that sentence carried anything under it, neither of us lifted the hem to check. She moved on to speak to a cousin, and I took my seat in the third row, which said family without quarrel. Julian took his place beside the officiant with the careful composure men practice when their suits have never fit better. When the quartet resolved into something recognizably processional, the crowd rose. Marina appeared at the top of the stone steps on her father's arm glow, distributed expertly across face and veil and fabric. She looked beautiful. She also looked like a person rehearsed to be a bride. I tried to find the woman I had shared coffee with twice in a neutral cafe, speaking gently around the place where we had hurt each other by proxy. For a second, I glimpsed her a quick, unmediated smile when she saw Julian, but then the music swelled and the aisle handled the rest. The ceremony was engineered to the minute. I stood when I was called and walked to the lectern and read the passage they had chosen, words about love that did not pretend to be rescue. As I read, the sentences changed shape inside my mouth, not because I added anything to them, but because my body recognized their measurements. When I finished, I looked up without meaning to, and Julian's face held a relief I had not expected to see less, like the end of a crisis, more like recognition. Vows rings a kiss that landed without theatricality, but with enough steadiness to satisfy the whole line of cross aunties. Applause carried everyone to the ballroom, where the ceiling was a lattice of light and the centerpieces insisted on being discussed. I accepted a glass of champagne and admired the engineering of the evening service, efficient without visible strain, a band that could pivot without panic when the best man decided his toast was actually a roast. Maya found me near the bar and rolled her eyes affectionately at a florid arrangement that had swallowed an entire foot of table space. "This costs more than my car," she whispered. We both smiled and did not say what I could have done with half the budget and twice the feeling. At our table, I sat with Julian's godparents and 2 friends of my late husband, who had kept their fondness steady in the years since. Conversation moved cleanly, travel books, the scandalously good bread. A woman I barely knew asked about a painting I'd mentioned months ago, and I talked about color as if it were a food group. No one asked me whether the napkins matched the runners. No one mistook me for staff. My place card said Eleanor Hart without title. After dinner, the band leader announced the first dances. Beatrice and her husband went first, executing a waltz that had been practiced until its seams didn't show. When they finished, the band leader turned toward our table and lifted a hand, and there was Julian beside me, his palm open, his throat working as if he had swallowed too much air. "May I?" he asked. I stood and put my hand in his, and the room rearranged itself into a circle we could stand in. We moved. I had taken a handful of lessons because going blank on a floor in front of strangers is a professional hazard, and because muscles can learn what conversations struggle to. He was better than he had been at prom, taller, of course, more certain. We found a frame that didn't press or retreat. "Your dress is very you," he said after a turn that went right. "Good," I said. "I wore it on purpose." "Thank you for reading," he said quieter, "for coming. Thank you for asking." We turned again. The room blurred and sharpened as the light swung. When the music slid into the last 4 bars, he squeezed my hand the way he used to when he had something to say, and no language for it yet. Then the song finished and the applause folded us back into the guests, and we were still ourselves. A little later, I stood with a plate of cake near the open doors where the night had collected. The lawn had returned to its non-ceremonial darkness, crickets insisting on their own soundtrack. Beatrice drifted over carrying a glass of white wine and the expression of someone who has chosen her next sentence. "You were right," she said, not heavily. "About belonging. I don't always know how to measure it." "Neither do I said. "I'm learning the feel of it." She nodded as if this were a technique one could practice. "Thank you for being here," she said again, and this time the thanks was personal. She moved off to redirect a cousin who had cornered the band leader with requests. I found Maya before I left and kissed her cheek. "Go home," she ordered, smiling. "You're a guest. Guests are allowed to leave without stacking chairs." Outside, cool air erased the day's sweet scents and gave me back the smell of ordinary grass. I walked to my car past a parade of black cars idling like patient punctuation, and when I sat behind the wheel, I didn't start the engine for a minute. My hands rested on the journal in my bag, on the pen that had already found its way into the pocket sewn inside the lining of my coat. At home, the rental's tall windows reflected a woman I recognized. I set the dress over a chair and placed the invitation in the top drawer of the desk, beside the leather journal that waited with a calm I envied. Then I washed the makeup from my face and stood at the sink with my eyes closed, listening to the sound the water made against porcelain, the small proof that a thing can pass over you and leave you cleaner without taking anything you meant to keep. 3 months after the wedding, I woke in a place that knew my name. The new apartment had tall windows and paint I'd chosen because it pleased me, oyster in the bedroom, a blue in the living room that shifted with the hour. The boxes were gone. The long table had been sold. In its place, a round walnut one that seated 6 comfortably, not 12 performatively. On the desk, the leather journal Julian had given me lay open to a page where my handwriting had finally loosened. Work adjusted around the new outlines. I said no to 3 spectacle-heavy contracts and yes to 2 smaller celebrations where the couples wanted light food and their people close enough to hear each other. At a charity gala, a last-minute keynote canceled, and the organizer asked if I'd say something about staying steady when the script explodes. I told a room of sequins about the year I stopped mistaking obligation for love. The next morning, a reporter from City and Sound called to ask for coffee. The profile ran 2 weeks later with a photograph that caught the silver in my hair and a headline I pretended not to mind. The call shifted after that. Not brides wanting bigger centerpieces, but women my age asking how I had changed a house without changing my name. An editor emailed to float a short column on reinvention, but pragmatic, she said no incense, no declarations, and I said I'd try one piece. The check was incidental. The feeling of writing something that didn't have a run of show attached was not. At a gallery opening in a converted mill on Front Street, Maya tugged me toward a wall of black and white photographs, facades of buildings I thought I knew, seen at angles that made them admit they'd always been strangers. The photographer stood nearby talking with a couple. He had gray at his temples and a careful way of listening that made people finish more honestly than they'd intended. When the couple drifted off, Maya introduced us. Eleanor Hart, he said, like trying on a name to check its fit. Rowan Larkin. We talked in the low, companional way people do when they're looking at the same rectangle. He asked what I noticed when I walked into a room. I said light and where people can breathe. He said he noticed thresholds. We had a drink at the bar next door and didn't explain ourselves more than that. When he asked a week later if I wanted to drive to the coast and photograph the old public baths at dusk, I said yes and didn't move anything off my calendar to make it possible. I simply went. Beatrice's name appeared on my phone on a Tuesday. I answered because avoiding someone who sits within your family's circumference takes more work than facing them. Lunch, she said. I've read the article. I have thoughts I'd rather say out loud. We met at a quiet place where the napkins were thick and the waiters understood time. She arrived polished and a little less taut, like a blown-up balloon that had been let to breathe overnight. She didn't rehearse courtesy. She began. I organized the engagement party to impress the wrong audience, she said. I knew it the moment I saw you at the wedding and felt relieved you hadn't come to the first event. I don't expect you to rescue me from that sentence. I'm not interested in rescues, I said. I am interested in people willing to revisit their math. She gave a small, real laugh. Then revisit this with me. From her bag, she produced an envelope, heavy stock, no crest. Richard and I are hosting a dinner for our 40th small at the lake house, family and friends who actually know us. I would be honored if you, and she paused. Not gossipy, simply curious, a guest would come. Thank you, I said. I accept. Relief registered and then moved aside for something like respect. I would also like to apologize without caveat, she said. Not for customs, not for miscommunications. I excluded you. It was ungenerous. I am embarrassed by it. I nodded once, apology received. We ate without fuss. When we parted, she touched my arm lightly the way women do when they want to acknowledge the past without dragging it behind them like a banner. That evening, Julian and Marina called from a sun-bleached apartment with tiles patterned like sea maps. They'd honeymooned in the Azores using points and nerve and a travel form I hadn't known existed. They looked young and tired and pleased. We're changing housing plans, Marina said. There's an old glass house on my grandparents' property. Everyone ignored it because it's not the big house. We want to make it ours. Not a greenhouse exactly, Julian added. Brick base, iron ribs, glass panes. It needs everything. But the bones are beautiful. I finished because I could see it without seeing it. He grinned, sudden and unguarded, the boy who once brought me a bolt he'd found on the sidewalk because he thought it might be a treasure. We'd like your eye, Marina said. Not as a planner, as someone who knows how rooms make people behave. Also, your friend the photographer. If he'd consult, we'd pay him. We want to document the process right. Ask him, I said. He'll tell you yes or no. They did later that week. Rowan met us out there on a day when the sky had decided to be merciful. The glass house wore dust and ivy and a dignity beyond repair estimates. We walked the perimeter and then the interior, speaking like people who understood that ideas need air. Light's brutal in summer, Rowan said, eyes mapping. But mornings I can see a room you'd welcome waking in. Marina traced a finger along a rusted bolt. My grandmother grew lemons in here, she said. I'd like to grow something different. Julian looked at me, not for permission, for recognition. I gave it. I signed the papers on the apartment the week the leaves turned. The place sat in the arts district, a block from a bookstore that stocked odd translations and a bakery that salted his croissants correctly. The first night I slept there, rain clapped at the windows, and I slept anyway. I woke early, made coffee, and wrote in the journal. The rooms know what they're for. Let them tell you. Belonging is a verb, not a seat. I did not make a list for the day. The day took care of itself. The City and Sound piece spun into an invitation to speak at a library auditorium. I said yes because I like libraries and because the event was free and open to whoever wanted a chair. The moderator was kind, the questions practical. Afterward, an elderly woman with a braid like a rope waited until the line thinned and said I sold the good china. My daughter told me I couldn't. I did anyway. I told her I hoped someone else would eat peaches from it now. A week later, a slim package arrived, the magazine issue glossy, with a note from the editor. You sound like someone who knows the difference between seating charts and kinship. I left it on the coffee table for a day and then filed it in a drawer with birth certificates and passports, not because it was official, but because I didn't need to see it to believe it had happened. The lake house dinner felt as careful as a hand placed on a shoulder and as unperformed as a good laugh. No string quartet, a single guitarist who knew when not to play. Beatrice's dress was blue and warmer than champagne. She sat me at a table with her sister and Julian's godparents, and a civil engineer who could talk about bridges without making you wish you'd become one. Later, she stood to speak, her voice carrying the way a practiced host's voice does, and she thanked people by name without flattening them into types. When she thanked me, she did it simply. Eleanor reminded me that a guest list is an essay, she said. It's stronger with the people you mean. On the drive back, Rowan steered with one hand and rested the other on the console. Not ownership, just presence. You looked like yourself in there, he said. I felt like myself, I said. It didn't sound like a revelation. It sounded like a weather report from a place you plan to live in. At home, I put the invitation to the dinner in the drawer with the wedding one. The round table caught the lamplight in a new way. I poured a small glass of the wine Beatrice had sent home with us and went to the window. The city offered itself in portions: brick-dark trees, a lone window still lit in the building across the street, where someone else was also not asleep yet. My phone buzzed face down on the table. A message from Julian saw, your library talk online. You, proud of you. Also, the glass house has lovely morning light. Send Rowan. The photo he'd attached took up the screen, their silhouettes inside and the rib cage of the old structure the sky caught in every pane. I put the phone beside the journal and capped the pen. The blue on the walls looked like a decision, and the windows did not apologize for reflecting me back. I turned off the lamp and let the room hold dark, the way a good stage holds silence after the last line, not because there's nothing left to say, but because the saying has landed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.